Good evening, everyone. I'm Stephanie Charleglio, your Woodbridge Town Clerk. Thank you for being. I would like to introduce you to Tom Hennick, our Freedom of Information Officer for the state of Connecticut. Tom will give you an overview of the Freedom of Information Act and then answer any questions that you might have about the Act. Thank you, Tom, and welcome to Woodbridge.
Thanks, Stephanie. Welcome, everybody. This is another new experience in the age of COVID, sitting here being recorded. Thank you for the invitation. Obviously, I wish all of you were here with us, but these are strange times indeed. I've learned to speak to a screen probably more than I ever thought I would, but we appreciate the opportunity to come out. We do these workshops all over the state, some more virtually in the last 18 months than others, but we do them not to beat you up, not to make you miserable, but to try to help. We try to give you some basics about freedom of information, to try to talk to you about some of the do's and don'ts, to try to help you. I know that on the call tonight, there are a lot of new board members, new commission members, some new chairmen as well. And don't be afraid to ask questions, folks, as we go forward. We've worked out a system that you can ask them as we go along, and then I'll also state at the conclusion of the little talk to answer others that you might have. A little bit about me before we start. Those of you who don't know, I'm not an attorney. I don't know whether that's good news or bad news. I always ask, but the reason I share that is that we're not going to give you any binding legal opinions here tonight. This is a workshop. The intention here is to teach, to try to help you. I'm in my 21st year at the Freedom of Information Commission, so I've been doing these sessions for a long time, and we want to try to help. We want to try to help you feel more comfortable, so that when we leave here tonight, you have a better overall feeling for freedom of information, how you handle it, what to do in certain situations. Just by the way, Steph, who introduced us, is a whiz with this stuff. Sorry, Stephanie. So if you have any questions, on the fly, she's always here to help as well. When we talk about freedom of information, we have to remember that it is the law in the state of Connecticut. It was the brainchild of Ella Grasso some 46 years ago. And it is sort of the child of the Watergate era. When Ella Grasso was contemplating her run for Congress, when she was contemplating her run for governor, she was in Congress, and she was watching Watergate explode all around us. And she was saying, if I run for governor in Connecticut, one of the first things we're going to make sure we do is create some sort of a law so that what I'm watching happen here doesn't happen in Connecticut. And what was happening here was a country that was in turmoil, a country that was beset by problems, many of which were created by government being conducted behind closed doors. Government conducted behind closed doors in secret. And we had a constitutional crisis. We almost had our government almost collapsed because of secrecy. So Ella said, when I run, and if I win, that's one of the first things we're going to do. And she was good to her word. She ran for governor, as you know, in 1974, was elected, and one of the first things she did in 1975 was put forward this concept for an open government law. And people said, well, gee, that's a good idea. And then she did something that was kind of interesting. She said, if this is so important to our state, I will see to it that this law is passed unanimously by our legislature. I always get a kick out of that. I said, can you imagine, if any of you have ever dealt with the legislature, your former first selectman always used to laugh when I told that, because she was around when that was going on in the legislature. And she guaranteed it, and she got it, folks. I've seen a video of the vote, the final vote. There wasn't a single no vote in the House, not a single no vote in the Senate. And this law was approved unanimously by our legislature. Imagine that. Think that could ever happen again today. I doubt it. But it shows you not only how important it was then, but how important it remains today. Transparent, open, clean government is critical to our democracy. It's the foundation for our democracy. Democracy only works if the people know what's going on. And that's what this law was intended to do. But not only showing you how important the law was and is, it also gives you some insight as to why we have these workshops. Because to get to the point where everybody could vote yes, everybody could comfortably vote yes, can you imagine conversations that went on? Can you imagine the negotiations, the back and forth, that, well, I like this concept. No, I don't like that concept. Can we do this? Can we do that? And ultimately, they came up with something that they could get everybody to buy into to vote yes. But when you read it, and usually at this point I say is, how many of you have read it? And a few hands just sort of sheepishly go up. And I say, your eyes roll to the back of your head. The wherefores and the whereases, and it's like, whoa, wait a minute. My instinct tells me we should be doing this, but the law seems to be telling me that. Well, that's because to get to the point where everybody voted yes, they left a lot to us, for those of us who are on the front lines, those of us who have to deal. And just by the way, I should have mentioned, those of you who are on boards and commissions, I feel your pain. I was on one board in my town for 10 years. I was a selectman for another 2. I'm on another board now. I get it. I get what it's like to rush home, have dinner, and then run to a meeting. And you didn't ask for this freedom of information stuff. You didn't. You said, wait a minute, I didn't sign up for that. I signed up to help Woodbridge. Well, you didn't sign up for it, but it goes with the territory because it is the law and it's something we all have to follow. We have to make sure that we understand what the law is about. But when you look into one of those areas where you think you know what it's saying and you have to be able to interpret it, you need the tools to work with to be able to make the right call so that you can not run afoul of the Freedom of Information Act. And ultimately, that's what we're doing here tonight, to try to give you some of those tools to work with so that you can make the right call. So you say, well, what does that mean, make the right? Well, in addition to writing this law, to the act, the actual codification of freedom of information, in 1975, the law also established the Freedom of Information Commission, which is where I work. The commission is charged with making sure that people are guaranteed the access that this law gives them. And if people believe that they haven't been given the right access, they can file complaints against you, the public agencies, or my public agency, claiming that they've been denied access. And then you would have to defend decisions you made when it comes to transparent government. Frankly, that's something you don't really want to have to do. You don't want to have to go to Hartford or at this point get on the phone or on a Zoom or a WebEx and defend a decision you've made. So the idea would be to give you the tools to work with so that you make the right calls, and then you're not in a position to have people filing complaints because you violated the Freedom of Information Act, or at least they allege that you violated it. The law is about 2 basic things. It's about access to public meetings and access to public records. And tonight, because I'm told many of you who are on this call are board and commission people, I'll put a heavy emphasis on the meetings provisions and give you a little bit about the records. And if you do have questions about anything that I don't touch on, please ask. Again, happy to answer them. But one of the first things I always tell people is, look, it's called freedom of information, but you have to sort of get it through your head that it's not really about free information. It's about access to meetings and records, as I just said. But a lot of people think that it is about free information. And they'll come strolling into town hall, masked, of course, and ask you questions. And what about this? And how about that? And where do we get that? Or go to the police department. Tell me, I saw a cruiser in my neighborhood last night. What happened? Freedom of information. I have a right to know. And your response, listen, we're all public servants. We're all going to answer those questions if we can. But understand that freedom of information does not require a public agency to answer questions. It's about access to your meetings and access to your records. So people who think that they can just sort of stroll in and ask questions because FOI exists, that's just not accurate. But they do it anyway. So at some point you might want to just sort of tamp that down and say, look, go to the meeting where this is being discussed. Then you can get the answer to your questions. Or get the records where the information is contained. Then you can get the answer to your questions. And for those of you who have to deal with the public, or you're at a board meeting and people start to ask you all kinds of questions, and you say, gee, do I have to answer those? And you say, this is too much, I don't want to do this. I want you to understand that you're not alone in that. In fact, at the Freedom of Information Commission, one of my tasks on a daily basis is to answer questions from people who call constantly on the phone, email, and some of you on the call and have called with questions. Happy to answer them, happy to do it. But sometimes they ask questions that fall outside of something that I can help them with. Think about working at the Freedom of Information Commission. People think that we are the information center for the entire state of Connecticut. First of all, they think that we have every record held by every agency in the state. They call us up and they say, send me this or send me that, they think that we sit in this giant vault, and all I have to do is push a button and out the records come. I have to explain to them that's not the case. I get called, asked to directions to the Capitol. I get calls about some people say, look, Tom, you should stop doing these workshops. You should maybe just do an hour of stand-up. It would be much more entertaining because some of these questions you get. Well, I won't do that, but let me share a couple with you just to show you how this can go sometimes. This is one that actually has a lifespan. Some of you may have even heard this before. It goes back 4 years. So this guy sends an email to me. True story. Please provide an electronic copy via email, preferably a spreadsheet showing all the Medicaid paid electroconvulsive treatments, aka ECT, aka shock treatment. My request includes every field you have available, but certainly not patient identifiers. This request includes, but is not limited to, the name of the psychiatrist, license number, date of treatment, age of patient, city, county, name of treatment facility, address of facility, cost of treatment, etc. And those of you who fill records requests will love the next line. Time frame, as far back as your computer records exist. Best regards, Ken Kramer, psychsearch.net. So when people send me emails like that, letters like that, and I get them almost daily, I have to explain to them that Connecticut, the FOI Commission doesn't get you the records. We're not a repository for records. You've got to go to the agency that has them. The agency either gives them to you or not, and then you come to us if you're not satisfied. So I send this response to this Ken Kramer guy. And most people, I will be honest, are appreciative. They don't understand, they don't get it. They're happy to know. Not old Ken. His response is this: well then, be a good public servant and get it into the correct hands instead of just blowing it off. Best regards, Ken Kramer, psychsearch.net. So I'm thinking that's another Christmas card I'm not getting that year, right? So time goes by, and son of a gun, about 3.5 years later, I see the email address, and I said, my God, he's back. This is a request for public records. Please provide an electronic copy via email of the name, company name, and address of the psychiatrist your disciplinary board contracts with to evaluate doctors. Again, why is he sending that to us? That's not what we do. I explained that to him last time. My instinct as a human being is to not bother. But in the freedom of information world, folks, just so you know, if you ever get a request for records, you always need to respond in 4 business days. Doesn't mean produce the records, but you always need to at least acknowledge in 4 business days, or else the requester can write to us with a complaint that you haven't, you're denying access. So always, so I said, okay, I got to write back to this guy, even though I'm not even remotely sure what he wants or where he would find it. But I gave him my standard answer before. So in addition to my standard answer, I add this. In this particular instance, I would have no idea who has the records you see. Could I be any clearer? His response: if you're not the person who handles public records requests, would you please get this into their hands? I don't appreciate being referred. Well, folks, sometimes you can't win for trying. But so for those of you who are frustrated by folks asking questions that you don't have to answer, I feel your pain. The guy called a couple weeks ago. Well, it's a couple months ago now. He says, sir, I need your help. I said, what's the problem? He said, I need a copy of my naturalization papers. I said, naturalization papers? He said, yeah. I said, isn't that a federal thing? Don't you have to go to the feds? He says, yes, I do. But when I went to them, they wanted $500. I thought you might have an extra copy lying around. You can't make it up. So folks, if you ever go down that path, I understand. Be polite as long as you can, but you're not going to violate the FOI Act if you don't answer a question or you don't produce something that you don't have. Access to meetings and access to records. Again, board members mostly on this meeting. Here's a definition. Meeting means any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency, any convening or assembly of a quorum of a multi-member public agency, in any communication by or to a quorum of a multi-member public agency, whether in person or by means of electronic equipment, just taken on greater meeting in the last 18 months, To discuss or act upon a matter over which the public agency has supervision, control, jurisdiction, or advisory power. Board members, when you are gathering to do your work in any way, shape, or form, and you have a quorum, it's a meeting, which means you need to notice it properly. You need to make sure that it's open to the public and that there are minutes of that meeting when the meeting is done. Proper notice. You prepare an agenda. I suspect there are some agenda preparers on this call. You want your agenda to be as specific as possible. You want to clearly apprise the public as to what's going to happen at that meeting. That agenda is then submitted to the town clerk and in your office, if your board has one, at least 24 hours before the meeting. Agenda preparers, just by the way, specificity is important. I've seen too many boards get dinged by our commission and also in court by just sort of having nebulous things on there that don't tell the public what's going on. You put the agenda in at least 24 hours in advance, you meet in public, and then you create minutes when the meeting is done. I'm speaking a little haltingly now because ever since COVID hit, there have been a few changes. I understand Woodbridge is now meeting virtually, no more in-person meetings. What I just told you applies to in-person and virtual meetings. But back in June, well, first of all, you're all aware of the governor's executive orders that he implemented in March of 2020 that allowed us to have these kinds of meetings, your meetings, planning and zoning, boards of selectmen, town councils, things like that, virtually. But there were some processes that were implemented with part of that. And at the end of June of this year, Public Act 21-2, Section 149 of 21-2, implemented some more rules which will be in effect till the end of April of next year, allowing boards to meet virtually. We had input as they put that together, and then after the legislature passed it, we put together we call it a primer, but it's really just sort of a guide. It's on our website. I'm going to leave Stephanie a few copies. I printed some out so that if you have chairman who want it, how to operate in a virtual world. There's a couple of things that I'll point out here that are different from what I said about the 24-hour notice. For instance, if you have a regular meeting that is going to be completely virtual or even a hybrid, some people in person, some people, there's a notice requirement in addition to the 24 hours. You have to make a notice, at least let people know that it's going to be virtual 48 hours in advance. Then you have to put the agenda in at least 24 hours in advance and make sure that the agenda has whatever link you're going to use to let people in. That's probably one of the critical things. Now, even though we're meeting virtually, the law is clear that it wants real-time access for everybody. So you create your agenda, again, specifying the items, then at the bottom or the top of the agenda, you have the link so that people can click in and sit at home or the bar or wherever they are to take part in the meeting. That 48-hour requirement, we sort of discovered this as we went along, a couple weeks into it, actually only applies to regular meetings. For special meetings, you go back to the 24 hours. I don't know why. But again, you want to make sure that the key is the real-time access. Another thing is with a regular meeting, if somebody comes up to you or writes to you, I should say, at least 24 hours in advance, and says, hey, I don't have a computer. My computer is broken. Could you please set up something somewhere in town hall or the library or something like that? And so that I can come and sit down and watch the meeting, you would have to do that as well. The law also requires, again, this is the law about virtual meetings, that the meeting be recorded and that or transcribed if that's what you have to do. And then that recording be posted on your agency website at least, within 7 days of the meeting. And then that transcription or the recording needs to be available for at least 45 days. So a couple other little tips in that. And again, I brought a couple copies. I'll leave them with Stephanie. It's also on our website. This is new to all of us, even though, it's a couple months in. Summer months, people didn't meet as much. But the key is making sure that people can still access your meetings. I mean, that's really the critical component. One thing that's interesting in this that they put in here is that they didn't make a provision for if your technology fails. if somebody is waving frantically that they can't hear, they can't because of the technology, the law says that you can continue with your meeting. I thought that was an interesting thing that they did. We've had a lot of little ins and outs and how do we do this and how do we do that? Like, for instance, there's questions about executive session, which I'll go into in a little bit, and a lot more detail in a little bit of time. We talk about waiting rooms or chat rooms or separate breakout rooms, and people have used all sorts of different machinations to get proper executive session. So we're all learning with the technology. The general consensus was that it's getting more people involved. Now I don't have any empirical data on that, but people were comfortable going home and staying home for the meetings, especially in the winter months. So we'll see what happens. There are committees studying this to see if any changes will be made, and that will take place over time. And then by the end of April, we'll know exactly where we stand, probably long term. The law talks to us about three different kinds of meetings. It talks to us about a regular meeting, a special meeting, and an emergency meeting. Regular meeting is a meeting you have per schedule that your board sets up by the end of January of every year. We meet on the first and third Tuesday, the second, fourth Wednesday, 7 o'clock town hall, 8 o'clock library, 6 o'clock board of ed office. A special meeting is almost the same as a regular meeting. The only thing that makes it special is that it's not at your regular place, date, time. You can do anything at a special meeting. You can talk about anything at a special meeting. You need to have an agenda at least 24 hours in advance. Same thing that I was just talking about before. What's the difference between a regular and a special meeting? The difference is this: at a regular meeting, should something arise that's not on the agenda, you can vote to add it to the agenda by a 2/3 vote of those board members who are present. At a special meeting, you can't add anything to the agenda. You can only talk about what's on that agenda. So agenda preparers, those of you who are out there, we tend to use items like old business, new business, other business. That's not the best agenda item, but for a regular meeting, it can pass because the chairman can say, is there any other business? Someone can make a motion, second, 2/3 vote to do it, you can add it. But at a special meeting, unless you are specific as to what that other business is in the agenda, you might as well take the item off, because you can't say, is there any other business? You can only talk about what's specified on the agenda. And that's the subtle but clear difference between the regular and the special meeting.
Tom, this is Betsy. I've got a
meeting. The emergency meeting is a meeting that I
Tom?
always discourage. Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
Oh, okay, good,
a question
great.
Came through on the chat, and the question is: has the FOI commit?
All right. Headphones on.
All right, is this better?
Yeah, sure.
So the question is: has the FOI Commission had any complaints about no audio, video or meeting on a town website?
No formal complaints, but we've gotten questions on it, and I suspect that there will be complaints shortly. When the governor's executive order was in place, you're going to chuckle. We weren't exactly sure who had jurisdiction, because the governor's executive order was not the law that we were, commissioned to uphold. But now that it's part of the law, I suspect we'll see complaints. Is that it? Okay.
Yes, that's it. If anyone else has questions, you can submit them via the chat function, or you could raise your hand and I could call on you.
Okay. Thanks, Betsy. So the third kind of meeting, the emergency meeting. The emergency meeting, folks, is a meeting that I really discourage boards and commissions from using. It's an unnoticed meeting. That's the main reason. And the bigger problem is that what you and I think might be an emergency doesn't always rise to that level in the eyes of the law. And, the example I like to use, we have holidays in Connecticut that are celebrated by some towns, by some school districts, and not by others. Veterans Day, Columbus Day, things like that. And I'll get a call like this, guarantee, after every one of those holidays. Veterans Day falls, let's say it falls on a Tuesday. Wednesday morning, the phone rings. Tom, I've got a problem. What's the problem? My regular meeting is tonight, Wednesday night. It's on the schedule. I always bring that agenda into town hall 24 hours in advance. Tuesday, I went to bring it down. Town hall was closed. I forgot we were closed. So I put it in this morning. Is that okay? Well, remember, I'm sitting here banging my head against the wall 24 hours. That's not 24 hours. My advice then is to go ahead with a special meeting. No, we've got way too much to do. I'm having an emergency meeting tonight, an emergency unnoticed meeting. My answer to that is please don't. Oops, I forgot. It's not an emergency. In our minds, especially those of us who aren't legally trained, it sure feels like one. My God, I can save this by having an emergency, but you can't. The bar is set really high. It doesn't want us to meet in an unnoticed fashion unless it's absolutely, positively necessary. People say, can you give us an example? Example would be, a couple of years ago, we had a winter where it seemed like we got 5 feet of snow every 30 seconds. And a couple of school boards, true story, started looking up at the roofs and going, uh-oh, we got a problem. And they had to meet like that morning to find a company with professionals to get up there and get that heavy snow off the roof, or they felt they were going to have a disaster on their hands. That was an emergency. Keeping people safe, keeping people out of harm's way. That's what the emergency meeting is set to do. Not we forgot to fill out an application on time, or, I forgot to bring in an agenda. You want to make sure that if you're going to do that, if you're going to have an emergency unnoticed meeting, it's a true emergency. And if you ever do, the law says you meet and you discuss about the whatever the emergency is about. You take whatever action you're going to take, and within 72 hours, create minutes. And the minutes reflect what the emergency was, who was there, and what you did about it. But again, my strongest advice is to try to avoid it. People say, well, what's the big deal? What could happen? I'll give you an extreme example. One of the Freedom of Information Commission's strongest powers is to declare null and void something that happens at a meeting. I'll shorten the story, but there's a town not far from here. They had a situation where the fire marshal, the assistant fire chief, thought he was about to become the next chief, and then found out he wasn't. Got very angry and had a confrontation with the first selectman. Beth, he feels your pain too, right? So he had a confrontation with the first selectman, and it got really heated and really ugly. And finally, the first selectman calmed him down. He'd known the guy for years. He calmed him down. He says, look, you're not going to be the next chief. We're going in a different direction. But I tell you what, I'll make you the interim chief while we're looking. Guy's not happy, but he accepts it and he leaves. But the blow up, boom, everybody heard it. It's a small town. We all live in small towns. It was all over town in a matter of time. And the phone starts ringing and the emails start and the text and the whole thing. Bottom line was everyone was saying to the first selectman, that's enough. This guy's crazy. He's a danger to you. He's a threat to you. Get him out of here. So the first selectman says, gee, maybe. And he calls an emergency meeting for the next morning, which is a Saturday morning. At that emergency meeting, they meet and they decide, you know what? The general population is right. He's fired. He's out. So it's a Saturday morning. They don't know where he is. They got to go find him. So they find him. They find him at home. I guess he was cleaning out his gutters or something like that. They haul him down to town hall with the leaves hanging out of his hair, the whole thing. And he says, what do you want? And they said, thanks for coming in. You're fired. He blows up all over again. You SOBs can't fire me. I quit. So they reconvene the emergency meeting and accept his resignation. Well, now he thinks about it. And remember what I talked about when people believe they've been denied the access, the right that they have under Freedom of Information, they file complaints with the commission. This guy felt that he had been wrong, that there was no emergency there, that they should have at least had the decency to notice the meeting and let it there. So he files a complaint and the commission agrees with him. It says, you know what? That was clearly an attempt to keep you out of the loop. We find in favor of the complainant and we declare null and void everything that happened at that meeting, which means that he is now fired and or quit at a meeting that didn't happen. End of story. But no, if you don't like a Freedom of Information Commission decision, you can appeal it. You can appeal it all the way to the state Supreme Court, which is what happened when the town didn't like what the FOI Commission said, took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And in this instance, doesn't happen all the time. In this instance, the Supreme Court agreed with the FOI Commission and declared null and void what happens. Now, if any of you are attorneys or you're familiar with the legal process, you're thinking, wait a minute, Supreme Court doesn't happen in a couple of weeks. It's more like 4 or 5 years. So those of you, if the Board of Finance is on the call here, wait a minute, the guy was fired, and then 5 years later, they said the meeting never happened. That means what? That means they have to figure out how much back pay they owe him because he was never supposed to be off the payroll. They had a mess on their hands. It took them another year to unravel the mess, all because they didn't wait 24 hours because in their minds, this was an emergency. If they had put in a notice for a meeting on Friday for Monday, they would have been all set. So again, that's an extreme example of what can happen, but just sort of, file it away and make sure that you're, if you're going to call an emergency meeting, it's really an emergency. Your meetings are open to the public. Anybody can audio or videotape your meetings. Now that's an interesting twist when we're meeting virtually. I took an email from a first selectman today. Can anybody, we're on Zoom, can they record it and not tell us? Folks, the law says that anybody can record a meeting, video or audio. My advice to boards and commissions is to say, you know what? Just assume that somebody's recording it. From my perspective, and by the way, one of those boards I was the chairman of for 5 years, and I always assumed that somebody was recording. And that's just an easier, simpler way to do it. And then you don't have to worry about what may or may not be said. Something that's interesting, some of you may know, may not know, Freedom of Information Act guarantees access to the meetings, but it does not guarantee anybody the right to participate. So public speaking, public comment, public participation is entirely in the hands of the board. You can hear from people, you can limit their time, you can tell them you don't want to hear from them. Now, the political ramifications, I don't want to get into that, but it's truly in the hands of the board. The board can control that. I get calls from people all the time. Hey, they wouldn't let me speak, or they would only let me speak about this topic or something like that. It's up to the board. You can do that any way you want. So sort of keep that in mind when you're, at a meeting and the room is full, someday in the near future, we hope, and there's a heavy topic on the table, and you're thinking this is going to last all night. You know what, folks? We're going to limit it to 3 minutes. We're going to limit it to 2 minutes. You have the right to do that. You have a right to control the meeting so that you can continue to do what you want to do. And control reminds me of another story. We'll sort of flip back to the whole idea of meeting remotely. I don't know. I can't see a show of hands, but has Woodbridge had problems with what's been called commonly Zoom bombing? Have you heard of that, Zoom bombing? Well, when this went into effect in March, when the pandemic really hit in March of 20, and people tried to, figure out how to meet remotely, everybody was in the house. Everybody was locked in. So people for ahas would click onto these meetings and start doing all sorts of crazy stuff. The funny ones, sort of brush off, but some of them were ugly. People would call in from Oklahoma and start, with racial epithets and with insulting people and calling board members, And so in that vein, you also have a right to control your meetings. You have a right to, if those people get on and they're disrupting the meeting and it's clear that they're only there to disrupt, you can shut them off. I'm telling you about real-time access and making sure everybody can join in, but you would have a right to kick those people off if you're in that kind of a situation. Let me digress. You'll get a kick out of this. I've had one experience with the Zoom bombing. I was doing a session like this from home, and it was for a League of Women Voters type group. It was not town officials, and we were talking away, and I was, as I am now, and all of a sudden the screen in front of me goes black, and this loud sort of dance merengue type music starts up, da 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 da, and my daughter was teaching her first graders remotely from my dining room, and I'm upstairs with the computer, and I thought it was her. And then she yells up, "Dad, what's that music coming from?" Uh-oh. As the music started, across the screen paraded the strippers. As I'm talking about freedom of information, the strippers are coming across the room, and they left very little to the imagination. Let's just put it that way. So you should have seen, like you folks that running the technical behind there. Thank you for doing this, by the way. We're plenty, and they finally got them off the screen. So if you ever have a situation like that, you're allowed to take them off. That was a funny Zoom bomb as opposed to the other ones that I was talking about. But again, the board has that kind of control. The board can run an orderly meeting. There are two paths that boards and commissions can take to exclude the public. The legislature tried to create a balance. One of them You heard me mention it before. I'm sure those of you who are on boards know what I'm talking about. An executive session. Now, executive session, remember, is a portion of a publicly noticed open meeting. It's not something that sits on an island by itself. A lot of times I'll get calls from people who say, hey, Tom, we've got a meeting coming up. It's an executive session. It's the only item. So we don't need to notice it, right? Wrong. Executive session is still part of a publicly noticed open meeting. You need to convene in public. You need to state the reason for the executive session. Then you need to make a motion and vote to go into that executive session. Again, you need that 2/3 vote of those people, present and voting, and you need to specifically state it. And the minutes, the motion and the minutes need to reflect what the reason was. Then you go into executive session and you have whatever discussion you're going to have. Never, ever, ever vote behind closed doors. Have your discussion, come out of executive session and vote, because the minutes need to reflect any action that was taken, who voted for what or for whom. It must be specific in the minutes, even if the only item was an executive session item that you came up to vote on. The 5 reasons for executive session: a personnel matter, pending claims or pending litigation, a security matter, real estate transaction. Let's suppose you're building a new school and you've got a school building committee, and the committee wants to negotiate with different landowners for just the right parcel, just the right piece of property to put that school on. You could do that behind closed doors. The law wouldn't make you have those kind of conversations in public, because you'd tip off the town's hand. Oh, good, look, this is what the town's offering. Somebody else wants the property, they're gonna buy it for more, or they'll undercut you, somewhat. So you could do that behind closed doors. The 5th reason for executive session, something of a broader catch-all type, if you will, allows a board or commission to have a conversation about a document or documents that it believes are exempt from disclosure. You are a board that seeks a written legal opinion from an attorney. You, as the board, become the client. You want to share that with the other board members. You want to discuss this legal advice that you've received. You go into executive session to have that conversation. You wouldn't have to share the documents, so you wouldn't have to talk about it in the public session. Let me wind back just for a second to the personnel executive session. First of all, when you're noticing that, executive session personnel is not enough. The courts have repeatedly said that's not enough. Executive session plan: discussion of the performance of a police officer, discussion of the performance of a teacher, discussion of the performance of a public works employee. You don't necessarily have to name the individual, but you certainly can give more than just personnel. And the law is really pretty clear about that. It wants more than that. Then the next step is you've got to make sure that the person's been notified. That the person's told, hey, we're going to talk about you in executive session tomorrow night. And if the person comes forward and says, no, you're not, I want that discussion to be held in public, the board cannot go into executive session. Where folks get confused is they say, wait a minute, they're talking about me. I should have a right to be in the room. So I don't want it in a public setting, but if you're going to talk about me, I get to be in the executive session. No, the law does not guarantee that. The law guarantees the right to demand it to be public. Once you waive that, the power flips back to the board. The board can invite, and frequently does invite, people in when they're going to talk about them, but it's not required. So remember, make sure the person's given notice and given that right to say, I want it. Executive session for pending claims and pending litigation, pretty much what it sounds like. There's a lawsuit, there's an FOI complaint, there's a CHRO complaint, and you want to talk about your strategy as it pertains to that, you could do that behind closed doors. It's a little broader in that it allows a board to contemplate taking legal action. You are a ZBA and you've denied somebody a variance to put that pool in his backyard. Puts the damn thing in anyway. And you want to show him who's boss, so the ZBA goes into executive session to determine how to make him, move the pool or pull it up or something like that. The board could contemplate that legal action without tipping its hand. The last one that I didn't go into much detail about, the security executive session. That's one that never really used to come up very much, but sadly it's come up more, especially with boards of education since Sandy Hook happened. And boards are going into executive session to have the kind of conversations that none of us ever imagined. Extra resource officers, security systems, bulletproof glass, things like that. The idea would be that they could have those conversations behind closed doors on the off chance that the wrong people are sitting in the audience. Oh, by the way, here's what we're going to do to protect the kids, and then they would know how to circumvent it. So they would have a right to do that behind closed doors. I need to stress, make sure you vote in public. Make sure you vote to go into executive session, come out, and then take any action you need to take. You can discuss as long as you want. Just make sure you vote in public so that everybody can have a clear vision as to what the decision was. The second path that boards and commissions go down to exclude the public is one of those areas where we are sure that there was a lot of discussion back in 1975. And the way this came out clearly was an attempt to keep everybody happy. The sentence after I read you about, executive session definition or of meeting, executive meeting definition of a meeting says this: meeting does not include. Meeting does not include. Then there follows a list of things, many of which everybody in this town would say, gee, that sounds like a meeting. The legislature said, well, that's swell. You can call it a meeting if you like, but for the purposes of freedom of information, it's not, which means it's not noticed, it's not open, there are no minutes. Collective bargaining. I know you have unions in town. Collective bargaining strategy sessions, negotiating sessions are not meetings for the purposes of FOI. Although if you walked by one in town hall, you'd say, that sure as heck looks like a meeting. You've got the police commission negotiating with the police union, but that's not a meeting for the purposes of FOI. Chance gatherings. I always get a kick out of this one. Chance or social gatherings. And the wording goes like this: neither planned nor intended for the purpose of discussing matters relating to official business. You're on the P&C and you like each other and you want to go to Carmine's for dinner together. You're not supposed to talk about P&Z business. Who are we kidding, right? When members of a board get together, what else are they going to talk about? Here's my advice on that, folks. Always, always remember that you're not supposed to, that we shouldn't be naive that you probably are going to, but keep it on the surface level. Do not get into those deep, deliberative conversations, those raging debates over dinner that you should be having here at the table or virtually at the table. Because I guarantee if you do it at a restaurant or a bar or something like that, the wrong person sitting in the next booth files a complaint that you've had an illegal meeting and you've got a problem. When you have these conversations offline, try to limit them to, gee, what did I miss at the last meeting? What's going to be on the next agenda? Can you believe what happened at the last meeting? Things like that. Keep it simple and don't, again, technically they're not supposed to happen at all. Reality check, they're going to happen, but just make sure that you're really careful that you don't do business offline. Do not set your budget over the eggnog at the Christmas party. Be really smart about the level of conversation you have offline. And to that end, when I read you the definition of a meeting, I don't know if you caught it. It said whether in person or by means of electronic equipment. Now that's in there since 1975. It was written back then for telephones, for a powerful council chair or board of ed chair gets on the phone and says, all right, I need your vote on this, your vote on that, bing, bang, boom, boom. I want your votes on that. And you come to the meeting and everybody's raising their hands and there's no discussion. Well, what happened? What happened is they had the meeting on the phone before the meeting took place. And electronic equipment today, folks, is a lot more than telephones. We're doing it now with the Zoom, emails, texts, Twitter, Facebook, all those things. I'm not telling you as board members to stop using those devices. I'm not telling you that they're bad or evil. But remember that when you create something, when you have an email conversation with somebody and it has to do with a board business, that's a public record. And somebody could ask to see that. And so now you've got a situation where you're having that deep deliberative conversation via email, that passionate argument that should be held in a meeting, that someone says, I want to see any and all emails between member A and member B. They're public records, out they come. First of all, your thoughts are out there when you may not have wanted them to be out there yet. And second is you've clearly had a meeting that shouldn't have been held. So be very careful the extent to which you use that amongst board members, and understand that you could be in a situation where you're having a meeting offline. Just be very smart to the extent to which you use that stuff.
Tom, I
The
have
last
this
thing
is
we talk
Betsy.
about with meetings is minutes. Oh, question. Earphones on. Yes, Betsy.
All right, thank you. So we have a question that came in from the public. Um, uh, it's a two-part question. One is,
Sure.
given that COVID rules are changing or could change, will we have updates when this happens? Part two is there a summary of the key points, such as the 60% vote rule for new agenda items, the 24 and 48-hour requirements for notices of meetings?
Yes. Updates, when we get them, you'll get them. One of the problems is, and the frustrations is that we don't always get them in a timely fashion. But yes, as for the summary, the electronic meeting part, I brought some of these with me. It's also on our website. Yes. And if you go on our website, uh, there is uh, there's a number of things on there. The FOI highlights, frequently asked questions, sort of a how do I, how do I do this? How do I do that? So that's all on our website. And also, I will leave with Stephanie. I have some little cards that I call the Freedom of Information. Where are they? Freedom of Information American Express card. Don't leave home without them. And they are highlights of the FOI Act. I'll leave some of these with Stephanie, and she can pass them out to you. So all of those things should help in that regard. Any other questions? As long as we've taken a break. Betsy, any others?
The only other one was very similar about asking for a quick guide. So I'll figure out a spot on the town's website to add that.
Super. Okay. So the last piece of the puzzle when it comes to meetings is minutes, and I suspect there's some minutes people out there as well. I will tell you that I feel your pain. I do the Freedom of Information Commission meeting minutes, and it can be a difficult proposition. But here's my key advice when it comes to minutes: they need not be the recreation of War and Peace. They are not meant to be a verbatim transcript. They are not meant to be the next great American novel. Technically, the only requirement for minutes is a record of who votes for what or for whom. Now, you're going to want more than that in there. You're creating the historical record for your town. You're going to put more than that in there, but it's not a requirement that it's a verbatim transcript. One of the questions that I get a lot, and I think one of them that came in here, was when people submit things to the board, must they be attached to the minutes? Especially in this virtual world, people are sending in emails and they want them read. And whether you read them or not is entirely up to you. That's not a requirement under FOI, but they want them to be attached to the minutes. That's just not a requirement. They become a public record. You can't just throw them away, but the minutes content is yours. And if you want them attached, you can, but it's not a requirement to do that. You want to have a clear, crisp, concise recapitulation of what happened, a record of the votes. It's got to be abundantly clear who the yeses were and who the nos were. You have your record of votes, your minutes, and then you want to make sure that the minutes are available in 7 days. So for another minutes question that was submitted here, it says, do the timeliness guideline of FOI apply to the approval of minutes? No, they don't. That's a very good question. Your minutes are your minutes. They are in after 7 days. Hey, we're not meeting for another couple of weeks. What does that mean? Well, that means that at the next mini meeting, you might approve them. And if you make any changes or alterations, that set of minutes, the next meeting set, reflects changes to the other ones. Because once you submit, those minutes are due in 7 days, they must be submitted, and they become a public record and they become the minutes. So you, in theory, look 2 weeks hence to make sure you've got the final version all wrapped up. I never recommend a second copy or a third copy of the minutes. That's way too much. The only time I would ever recommend that is if the changes and the amendments and alterations make the first set so unrecognizable, you put a second set in there, but then you'd have 2 sets of minutes, and that could get confusing. So 1 set of minutes done within 7 days, and make sure that any changes you make are reflected in the set 2 minutes. 2 weeks hence when you meet again.
Tom? Tom?
Yes. Okay.
All right. Sorry, there were a few questions that I missed.
Okay.
So one of the questions is, if some boards or commissions do not want to be on TV, it's okay to just have an audio recording. Is that correct? Or does it also need to be audio or video?
Well, it says virtual and it could be audio. There are I wouldn't get too comfortable with that because I suspect that at some point boards would want to the legislature is going to want everybody, at least board members, to be seen, to be have their visages on the screen if you're going to meet virtually. But right now, it's not required. That's correct.
Okay. So the next question is, if a 2/3 vote is not taken to add an item to the agenda, what's the remedy? Does the board have to retake the vote?
My suggestion, my strongest suggestion, would be yes.
Okay.
At the next meeting or at a special meeting, if it's that critical, uh, hey guys, we goofed, we forgot to add this to the agenda. I've seen way too many complaints come in that a board didn't properly add something to the agenda, and the board or the agency was found to be a violation.
Okay. Next question, I think you already answered, but I'm going to ask it anyways.
Okay,
Can you stipulate rules for public comment?
absolutely yes, yes, and in fact, if you've got a rowdy bunch out there, I would recommend it.
Okay. Um, Next up, during a board executive session, if a vote did not take place, is the action that was discussed legal? What if the person who was being discussed was not notified? Is everything that was discussed legal for the board?
Okay, so the first part of that question was, is everything legal if no vote was taken? You can discuss till the cows come home, and there's no requirement that you take a vote. So that piece would be a yes. That's not a problem. You go into executive session appropriately for one of the 5 reasons. You have the discussion. You can come out and say, folks, we had a discussion about what we said we were going to discuss. No action was taken. The second part is that could be a problem. If a person is discussed in executive session, not notified, and some action may be taken about that person, that could be a violation. There could be some ramifications there, especially on a personnel matter.
Okay. And the last question I see here is, sometimes draft minutes from boards or commissions are not posted for months. Is that a violation?
There's no requirement that minutes actually be posted. They need to be available. If they're not available in 7 days, yes, that's a violation. They must be available. But some people call up and say, I'm looking for these minutes on the website and stuff like that. Another quick, the history of FOI story. Back in 2008, the legislature passed a law that said you must post your minutes on your website. And then a year and a half later, they rescinded it. So there is no requirement that minutes be posted on websites. So if it's not on the website, there's no violation. If it's not available in 7 days, that's a problem. They must be available in 7 days. Any other questions on meetings before I jump over to a little bit about records? Betsy or anybody? Okay, let me talk a little bit about public records. And I say a little bit because as board members, you probably won't get too many issues that sort of you have to wade into that involve records requests. Most of the records requests that come to you, you'd probably deal with a staff member who would help you with it, or with the town clerk who would help you with it, or So most of those do not come to board members, and most of those come to public offices. But what you need to know as board members is that you become public officials, public office. Whether you like the title or not, that's what the law says. And as such, when you create a record, anything, or take in a record, or receive a letter from a constituent, anything that has to do with Woodbridge business becomes by definition a public record. And in theory, anybody could ask to see it, or anybody could ask to get a copy of it. And if that happens, first of all, that little story I told before, remember that you should always respond in 4 business days. You should always respond, and it's not to produce the records necessarily, it's thank you for your FOI request, we're looking into it. A lot of people then say, well, how long do we have? What is it? Well, it's kind of an open-ended thing. The law actually says that you must provide access to these records in prompt fashion. And that's clearly in the eyes of the beholder. It depends on the size of the request. It depends on how many staffers are, during this period of the pandemic, some town halls were closed. It took a lot longer. People couldn't access the records. They were paper. They weren't electronic. You get the idea. That all is a factor into what constitutes prompt. And guess what? What the requester thinks is prompt and what the agency thinks is prompt may be diametrically opposed, and it may lead to a confrontation. It may lead to a complaint. But that's why I say to you, you make your best determination based on what you think is fair. The courts gave us this. Yeah, we'll tell you what prompt is. It means without undue delay. I don't know. That doesn't help me all that, but again, in the spirit of transparency, of reasonableness, of not, you don't make it the last thing you do. That's how I would do promptness. So you make sure that the records are produced promptly. Now, when I do these workshops for town officials, town offices, we spend a lot of time talking about records because yes, everything by definition is a public record, but then there are exemptions, there are exceptions, there are exclusions to disclosure, which makes some of the records, basically take them off the board. Records that constitute an invasion of privacy. If you're looking for educational records of students who aren't your own kids, come off the board. When you're dealing with police records that have to do with ongoing cases can be withheld. You get the idea. There's a wide spectrum of different kinds of records that might be withheld. But remember that regardless of where you are, regardless of where you create the record, it becomes a public record by definition. It's not like, oh, it's mine. It's a Woodbridge record. Before I release it, do any of the exemptions apply? You get help or you look them up yourself, and then you think about releasing the records. People stop and think. I cannot stress this enough. Think before you send. You do not want to see it on the front page of the New Haven Register. Don't send it. I'm telling you, you want to be really careful. Well, I was working at home. Well, a lot of us were working at home, since last March. I was at work. I was at my office, so it can't be it is subject. That doesn't mean that somebody comes and grabs your laptop or your phone or something like that. But it means that you would be asked to extract those records and turn them over should somebody make a request for them. Let me just give you an example of a couple. Well, before I do that, a couple other things. You're never required to create a record that you don't have. A lot of times people come to a public agency or a board or commission and say, I want a list of this or a list of that. I was talking to a registrar today from Preston who said they're asking me for a mailing list. Do I have to make them a mailing list? No. If you don't have a mailing list, it's not a record that's subject to freedom of information. You certainly don't have to you have to create it. You don't have to do research for people. You don't, well, can you tell me how I figure out? And, again, the folks have to do some of the work themselves. You don't have to create a record. You don't have to do research for people. There are two ways to ask for access to a record. They can ask to look at it or ask for a copy. If somebody just wants to look at a record, they can inspect the record. The promptness provisions still apply, but there's no fee. There's no charge. They would, you find the record, determine that it's not exempt, you let them look at it. If they are looking for a copy, you can charge them up to 50 cents a page. Now, this law was written 46 years ago, and it hasn't quite caught up to where we are with our use of electronic records. There is no fee for electronic records. So if somebody asks for emails and there are no redactions or anything like that involved, you just shoot them off. There's no fee. There's no fee for labor or anything like that. A lot of public agencies wince when I say that, but I can only tell you what the law says. I didn't write it. It's what the law said. Another little gem that's come up recently is that people want to come in to a town hall or a board and they want to take pictures of their records. And the law says law says nothing about that. There's no provision for that. There's a provision for a handheld scanner, a battery operated wanding device, and you can charge $20 for someone to do that, but it doesn't apply to that. What we have recommended is that state agencies try to work that out until the legislature includes phones in that scanning provision in section 1-212. But you want to make sure that if you're going to let people take pictures, you're consistent with it. You charge them a fee, not charge them a fee, with the understanding that the FOI Act would not require you to do that. But in the spirit of getting along and transparency, we've recommended that you try to work something out when it comes to that. One story about records. how dangerous it can be to not think before you send. I'll actually share two of them. So during our recent pandemic time, most of us were working at home. We weren't seeing our colleagues, and in a major city's law department, they were looking for a senior legal secretary, and they were conducting all the interviews online or phone. I'm not sure exactly what. And they'd reached a point where they had to cut some people down. So the head of the law department of this major city in Connecticut sends an email to a colleague. Now, we'll cut him some slack. I think he was just trying to have some fun. But remember, this is the head of the law department sending an email to a colleague. I would like you soon to reach out to a woman's name on behalf of the law department to thank her for her interest in the position and to inform her that we went in another direction. I feel that you have the most experience in our office handling these types of discussions after many years of breaking off relationships with your past girlfriends and flings. You can't make it up. So, what is he doing, right? So he sends that to the other lawyer, and they're okay because you're saying, who's going to see it? As we all know, we're operating virtually, and that other lawyer was in a deposition in an open court, again, virtually, and that accidentally popped up on the screen and the whole world saw it. Think before you send, people. Think before you send. I took a phone call a couple of months ago from a woman. She says, "Hi, my name is Sean." I said, "Hi, Sean. How are you?" She said, "Good." She said, "I'm calling you from Georgia." Georgia. It's calling Connecticut FOI from Georgia. She says, "Yeah, my husband is an out-of-state contractor, and he had a job in Connecticut last summer. And I think he had an affair with a state worker." Well, why is she calling me? It wasn't me, right? She's calling me because she wants to know if she can see that state worker's emails and her text messages. And my response is, if they have to do with state business, the answer is yes. So the email that she wrote to him that said, "Meet me at the construction trailer at 6 o'clock. We'll review the blueprints for the project." And then, ... It's a public record. It's a public record. So think before you write, think before you send. A lot of times I get questions about, the different exemptions and stuff like that. Again, there are many. We could spend hours going over them. For board members, it's not as critical to know what you can't give out or have a right to withhold, but to know where to go to look at the FOI Act, call us for help. By the way, I mentioned that I spend a lot of time on the phone answering questions. I didn't work yesterday. Today I answered 30 some odd calls. They just keep coming. There's no problem with that. We want you to call. You now have a face, even if it's on the screen, to put with the voice on the other end. There may be questions that you didn't want to ask tonight because you said, "Gee, it may sound stupid." But by the way, no question is stupid when it comes to this law. I'll be in the office tomorrow morning. You want to call and ask, be happy to answer it. And I'm also not afraid to say, I don't know, because there are parts of this law that are complex, that are difficult to put your arms around. I'll ask somebody. I'll ask one of our attorneys, and we'll get you the best answer we can. And it's not an order. Even if you call and you ask us a question, it's not an order. It's not a command. It's an attempt to help, to try to teach you, to try to give you the guidance so that you don't wind up before the commission with a complaint, so that you run a transparent and open town, and you're able to focus on the business that you were elected or appointed to do, and not sort of spending a lot of time worrying about content of agendas, minutes, and stuff like that. I will stop there. If there are other questions, now's the time.
So, Tom, this is Betsy.
Okay.
I've had one come in since my last round of questions.
All right.
The question is it okay to require that public comment be submitted in advance of a meeting and not given in real time?
In this virtual world, if that's the way you want to do it, I think it would be fine. Again, because nothing in the FOI Act requires a board to offer a public comment. So if that's the way you want to do it, that would certainly be okay.
I do not see any other questions at this time.
Are there any other folks that, jump in if you have any? Apparently not.
People are also able to raise their hand if they're interested in asking a question. It doesn't all have to be written. I do not see anyone else with
All right.
their hand raised right now or any other submitted questions.
Well, as I said, what's going to happen, Betsy and everybody, is that as soon as we hang up, you're going to say, "Oh, I should have asked." Do not hesitate to pick up the phone tomorrow. Send an email. We'll be happy to try to get you the right answer. I'm going to leave some goodies, I guess, documents with Stephanie that might be helpful. And if that's it, Beth, technical support.
One more
Steph,
time.
okay.
One more.
Okay. Yeah.
Two more.
Wasn't fast enough.
The first question, here we go. The first question is, please repeat the injunction against working or conversing offline and how many people makes a meeting?
Well, I wouldn't call it an injunction, but the definition of a meeting means any hearing or other proceeding of a public agency. So if you've got a quorum of a board or of a committee, and by the way, I should have mentioned this if I didn't more strongly, this includes subcommittees. You form a subcommittee, it becomes a separate public agency by definition, and they would have to follow the rules that we've been talking about. Any quorum of those boards getting together and having a conversation in any way, shape, or form would be a meeting.
And the next question is, can a motion that was made, seconded, and voted on be stricken from the minutes?
I would say no. I would say no unless there was a motion to strike it. In other words, you can't just take it out arbitrarily. And I'm not an expert on Robert's rules or whether that's allowed statutorily, but the only way under FOI that could happen is that there was a motion to rescind, the motion was seconded, and then the vote was taken. The motion made and seconded and voted on would have to be in the minutes in some fashion.
All right, that was my last question.
Okay, well, folks, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I hope
Tom, this is Beth.
Yeah.
I just want to thank Stephanie very much for putting this together for everyone and encouraging everyone who attended to be sure to check with her or with you if they do have follow-up questions. And most importantly, Tom, I want to thank you for taking the evening and spending it at Woodbridge on behalf of all of our board and commission members and everyone else. Thank you so much.
You're more than welcome. Happy to do it. Good to see you all. Good night, everybody.
Okay.